Open your freezer right now. Count the compartments. One meal, no separation, everything touching everything else. 50 years ago, that would have felt like a betrayal, because the entire promise of a 1960s dinner was the wall between the peas and the potatoes. This isn't just about frozen food. It's about the last time a Tuesday night in America came divided into 3 neat little rooms of aluminum, and how all 25 of those rooms quietly closed forever. There are 25 of them, and the reasons they disappeared teach you something bigger about how convenience always costs you a little bit of soul. Before we count them down, picture the sound. The oven door creaking open at 425 degrees, the hiss of foil peeling back, the smell of gravy that had been sealed in a box since a factory in Omaha packed it 8 months earlier. That sound is gone. So let's bring it back, one tray at a time. Salisbury steak with peas and whipped potatoes. This was the flagship, the tray that taught America what a TV dinner even was. A dark, glossy patty of ground beef sat swimming in brown gravy, corralled next to a square of buttery whipped potatoes and a pile of bright green peas. Families ate it off metal folding tables in front of the television, the tray balanced on knees, the foil lid used as a makeshift napkin holder. It vanished not because people stopped loving Salisbury steak, but because microwaves hated aluminum, and by the mid-70s the whole industry pivoted to plastic trays that could zap in 4 minutes flat. Fried chicken with corn and whipped potatoes. The fried chicken tray was the Sunday dinner stand-in for households too tired to actually fry chicken. 2 crispy battered pieces, a scoop of sweet corn kernels, and that same whipped potato square appeared in almost every freezer case in the country. The batter never got truly crisp in the oven, but nobody minded because the whole point was that somebody else had already done the work. It disappeared as fresh rotisserie chicken counters took over supermarket delis in the 80s, offering the same shortcut with real crunch. Turkey with cornbread dressing and sweet potatoes. This was Thanksgiving in a box, available every week of the year. Thin slices of turkey breast lay under a blanket of dressing, studded with celery, next to candied sweet potatoes, glazed just enough to look festive. It let single men and widows in small apartments taste a holiday meal on a random Wednesday in March. As candied yams became less common on modern menus and turkey slid out of weekly rotation, this tray quietly slipped off shelves by the early 70s. Meatloaf with tomato sauce and green beans. Ground beef and breadcrumbs baked into a dense brick, topped with a sweet tangy tomato glaze, next to a tangle of green beans boiled soft. This was the tray dads reached for when mom worked the night shift. The tomato sauce caramelized slightly at the tray's edges during baking, creating a burnt sugar crust kids fought over. Meatloaf itself never died, but this particular frozen configuration got replaced once home cooks realized meatloaf freezes and reheats just fine from a casserole dish. Fish sticks with macaroni and cheese. Breaded cod fingers, 6 to a tray, sat beside a small pool of orange mac and cheese that never fully melted in the oven's dry heat. This was the Friday night Catholic household special, tied to meatless Fridays before Vatican II relaxed the rule in 1966. Once that religious obligation faded, so did the built-in weekly demand. And fish sticks migrated to their own standalone freezer bags instead of a compartmentalized tray. Chicken pot pie, not a tray at all but a small foil pie dish, this one broke the 3-compartment rule entirely. Flaky top crust hid a filling of chicken, carrots, peas, and potatoes in a thick, peppery gravy that bubbled up through cracks in the crust as it baked. It was the closest thing to a home-cooked Sunday supper the freezer aisle offered. Individual pot pies survived, technically, but the 1960s foil dish format, with its papery bottom crust, gave way to sturdier plastic bowls by the Nixon administration. Ham with scalloped potatoes and peaches. A thick pink slice of ham lay next to a compartment of scalloped potatoes baked in cream, with candied peach slices tucked in a small dessert corner. The peaches were syrupy and slightly metallic from the tray, but nobody complained because dessert built into dinner felt like magic. This one disappeared as ham slices became a deli counter item rather than a frozen one, and canned peaches lost their place as an everyday dessert once fresh fruit became cheaper year-round. Beef pot roast with potatoes and carrots. Shredded, well-done beef sat in dark gravy next to roasted potato chunks and carrot coins, meant to mimic a Sunday roast without the 4-hour cook time. The beef was often tougher than fresh pot roast, chewy from the freezing and reheating process, but it filled the house with a smell close enough to the real thing. As slow cookers became a $20 kitchen staple in the 70s, families realized they could get an actual pot roast with almost no more effort, and this tray faded out. Swiss steak with rice, a tenderized, breaded beef cutlet smothered in a tomato and onion gravy, sat over a bed of rice instead of the usual potatoes. A rare regional variation that showed up mostly in Midwestern freezer cases. The rice soaked up the gravy and turned a deep orange-brown by the time the foil came off. Swiss steak itself faded from home cooking entirely by the late 70s, a casualty of change in butcher cuts and the rise of quicker beef dishes, taking this tray down with it. Veal Parmigiana with spaghetti. A breaded veal cutlet under melted mozzarella and red sauce sat beside a small tangle of buttered spaghetti, marketed as an exotic, almost restaurant-quality option compared to its meatloaf neighbors. Veal was already a luxury meat, so this tray carried a premium price tag that priced out casual weeknight buyers. As veal fell out of favor nationally through the 80s over animal welfare concerns, and Italian-American restaurants made the real dish cheap and available, the frozen version had nothing left to offer. Salmon croquettes with peas and rice. Small breaded patties of canned salmon, fried crisp on the outside and soft inside, sat next to plain white rice and a scoop of peas. This was a budget-conscious tray built around canned fish that was cheaper than fresh, popular in coastal and inland households alike during grocery-tight years. Canned salmon eventually became more expensive relative to fresh fillets, and the croquette format felt dated once fish sticks and battered fillets took over the seafood freezer section by the early 70s. Beef stew with biscuit. Chunks of stew beef, potatoes, and carrots in thick brown gravy sat next to a single dense dry biscuit, meant for sopping up sauce. The biscuit never rose properly in the tray's shallow well, staying flat and slightly gummy, which became something of a running joke among kids forced to eat it. Canned beef stew from brands like Dinty Moore offered the same comfort for less money, and this tray couldn't compete on price once inflation hit grocery budgets hard in the early 70s. Fried shrimp with French fries. Butterflied shrimp in a crunchy batter sat next to a small pile of crinkle-cut fries, a coastal-inspired tray meant to feel like a trip to a seafood shack without leaving the living room. Shrimp was a luxury protein at the time, so this tray sat at the top end of the price range, often reserved for a Friday night treat. As shrimp prices fluctuated wildly through the 70s due to import shifts, the tray became inconsistent to produce, and manufacturers dropped it rather than gamble on cost. Chopped sirloin with onion rings. A thick, hand-formed beef patty sat under a pile of crispy onion rings instead of gravy, next to a scoop of whipped potatoes marketed as a step above the standard Salisbury steak. The onion rings went soft and pale during baking, losing most of their crunch, which frustrated buyers expecting a steakhouse experience. Once backyard grilling exploded in popularity through the 60s and 70s, families realized a real hamburger patty on the grill beat this tray in every way that mattered. Shredded turkey and mushrooms in a creamy sherry-tinged sauce sat over egg noodles, topped with a light dusting of Parmesan that browned slightly under the oven's heat. This was one of the more sophisticated trays, aimed at housewives entertaining a bridge club rather than feeding hungry kids. Tetrazzini as a dish faded from American home cooking almost entirely by the 80s, seen as fussy and old-fashioned next to simpler pasta dishes, and the frozen version disappeared right along with it. Corned beef hash with poached egg. Crisped hash made from corned beef and diced potatoes sat next to what was supposed to be a poached egg, but usually reheated into something closer to hard-boiled. A rare breakfast for dinner tray. It leaned on the country's love of canned corned beef hash, already a pantry staple since World War II rationing days. As the egg component consistently failed to reheat properly in home ovens, consumer complaints piled up, and manufacturers quietly discontinued it rather than solve the science of a frozen poached egg. Beef enchiladas. Rolled tortillas filled with seasoned ground beef, smothered in a mild red chili sauce and a blanket of melted cheese, represented one of the earliest Tex-Mex dishes to reach mainstream American freezers. The sauce was tame by later standards, built for palates that considered black pepper daring. As authentic and semi-authentic Mexican food chains spread nationwide through the 70s, this watered-down version couldn't hold up next to the real thing arriving at strip malls everywhere. Welsh rarebit with bacon, a thick, sharp cheddar cheese sauce spiked with beer and mustard powder, poured over toast, topped with crumbled bacon. This was one of the strangest and most old-fashioned trays on the list, a holdover from British-American comfort food traditions. Younger buyers in the 60s had no cultural memory of rarebit as a dish, so it read as confusing rather than nostalgic even then. It was quietly pulled from most regional freezer lines by the mid-60s, one of the first casualties on this entire countdown. Beef chow mein, thin slices of beef and celery in a glossy brown sauce sat over crunchy fried noodles, America's introduction to Chinese-American food for households nowhere near a Chinatown. The noodles stayed crisp because they were packaged separately from the sauce, a small innovation ahead of its time. Once real Chinese restaurants and takeout spread into suburban strip malls through the 70s, the gap between this tray and the actual dish became too obvious to ignore, and it slid into obscurity. Not a full dinner but a dedicated dessert tray, layers of spiced apple slices, and buttery, cinnamon-crusted breadcrumbs baked into a small foil dish meant to be eaten warm straight from the oven. It was often bought as a treat alongside a savory tray, doubling the oven time but giving kids something to look forward to. As boxed cake mixes and pre-made pies became cheaper and more convenient, this humble colonial-era dessert lost its foothold and vanished from freezer cases entirely by the early 70s. Chicken a la king. Diced chicken and pimento peppers in a rich, sherry-scented cream sauce sat over a biscuit or piece of toast. A dish that had been a genteel restaurant staple since the 1920s, finally reaching the mass freezer market decades later. The sauce often broke or turned watery during reheating, a texture problem manufacturers never fully solved. As the dish's old-money restaurant reputation faded from American dining entirely, the tray lost its aspirational appeal and disappeared along with the dish's last remaining fans by the 70s. Lobster Newburg, a luxury tray built around chunks of lobster meat in a rich sherry cream sauce over rice. This was the most expensive and most ambitious frozen dinner ever attempted in this era. An attempt to bring high-end restaurant dining into a middle-class living room. The lobster meat was inevitably rubbery after freezing and reheating, a texture crime that seafood lovers never forgave. It disappeared within just a few years, proving that some dishes simply refused to survive a trip through an aluminum tray and a home oven. Southern fried chicken livers with rice. Chicken livers dredged and fried until crisp on the outside, sat over rice with a small side of gravy. A regional southern tray that never quite found an audience outside its home territory. The livers had a mineral, iron-heavy flavor that either people loved deeply or couldn't stomach at all, leaving no middle ground for casual buyers. As organ meats fell out of everyday American eating through the 60s and 70s in favor of muscle cuts, this tray lost its built-in audience and quietly disappeared from shelves. Yankee pot roast with peas and onions. A New England twist on the pot roast tray, this one paired shredded beef with tiny pearl onions and peas instead of carrots and potatoes, chasing a specific regional palate in the Northeast. It sold well in New England markets, but never expanded nationally the way its Midwestern cousin did, staying a regional curiosity rather than a household name. Once the more popular pot roast tray absorbed the entire category's shelf space, by the early 70s, this quieter regional version simply stopped getting reordered. Beef tips with noodles and peas. Small chunks of beef in a dark, peppery gravy sat over egg noodles, with a scoop of peas, the tray so unremarkable that almost nobody photographed it, wrote about it, or remembered its name. Yet it appeared in nearly every freezer case across the country through the entire decade. It asked nothing of anyone, offered no surprises, and delivered exactly the comfort its label promised every single time. That quiet reliability is exactly why it vanished without a trace once flashier, cheaper options crowded it off the shelf by the mid-70s. That's the real answer buried under all 25 trays. It was never really about the food. It was about a specific 15 minutes in American life, the door closing after the oven click, foil steam curling up in the kitchen light, and a family arranging itself around a glowing screen with dinner already solved. The trays disappeared because the microwave got faster, the ingredients got cheaper somewhere else, and the culture stopped needing that particular ritual. But if you ever peel back foil from a modern frozen dinner and catch that same metallic steam smell, you're standing exactly where your grandparents stood, and that's worth remembering every time you do it. If this trip through the freezer aisle brought back a memory, hit like and subscribe for more forgotten pieces of American history.